Okay, we are going to start today's event. There are still people joining, but I am going to start because we have a full and exciting schedule for you today. Hello, my name is Dominic Mitchell, and I'm the Operations Manager here at DOAJ. I'm the chair of Think Check Submit, and I'm also chair of OASPA, the Open Access Scholarly Publishing Association. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome you all, wherever you are in the world, to this third and last webinar in a series of events marking DOAJ's 20th birthday. On the 12th of May 2003, DOAJ was launched as a list of around 300 open access journals after a call at a conference to produce an index of open access titles. The index was needed, and I quote, to help restore order and structure to the published literature that was being published in new repositories and open access journals that had started to appear at that time. From the beginning, DOAJ's mission was one of instilling trust in open access for the community. And 20 years and more than 20,000 journals later, this hasn't changed. It's been an incredible year for us here in the DOAJ team. It's the first time we've held webinars on such a large scale, and each event has been a highlight on our calendars. Our community manager, Katrina Sunsberg, has expertly directed the events, and indeed, we've been brought closer than ever before to our global community of users, with attendees and speakers from all over the world. All three events have collected 1,500 registrations, and our recorded webinars have been watched over 650 times on YouTube. For this event alone, we've had 395 registrations from 68 countries, as you can see on this map. We invite all of you who are attending today to say hello to your fellow attendees in the chat and let them know where you are in the world. There is important information you need to know about today's webinar. First of all, please post any questions in the Q&A and don't put them in the chat because they might get missed. The closed caption feature is available in many languages. You'll see a button at the bottom of your Zoom window to enable that if you wish. At the end of the event, we'll post a link to a feedback form. Your feedback is really important to us, so please take the 3 minutes to fill it in. Finally, today's event is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent out to all registrants after the event. We'll also send a link to the feedback form, so don't worry if you can't stay around at the end to get the link to that form. You can find all of DOAJ's recordings and transcripts on our YouTube channel. So, what is trust? Well, the English word trust comes from Old Norse, the ancient language of modern Scandinavia. The Cambridge Dictionary defines trust as believing that someone is good and honest and will not harm you, or that something is safe and reliable. However, trust has become larger than strong, safe, and reliable. And this slide introduces some words or phrases that are commonly associated with trust or distilling trust in us. The diversity of these concepts is staggering. We hear the word trust all the time, especially in the digital age of the internet. Digital communication, while being efficient, effortless, and open to all, is also fleeting, transitory, and can be hard to trace. It can be hard for us as consumers of digital information to know whether something or someone can be trusted. Checking your sources to verify and trust the information in front of you is more important than ever. 2023 is the year that artificial intelligence exploded into our worlds, and its uptake into our everyday lives is frighteningly rapid. AI means that the boundaries between trust and untrusted are becoming even harder to distinguish. Today's webinar will take a look at what trust means in the context of scholarly communication and publishing. It will explore the qualities of trust, how trust evolves over time, how trust must be earned, and how trust is affected by internal and external factors that exist in and around a community. To take us on today's journey, I'm honored to introduce you all to our moderator, Joy Owango, the founding director of the Training Center in Communication in Kenya, an award-winning trust set up in 2006. Joy will introduce us to today's speakers. I wish you all a great event and thank you for joining us. Over to you, Joy.
Thank you, Dominic, and welcome everybody from wherever you are in the world. It's evening here in Nairobi, Kenya, and I'm really excited about moderating today's webinar. And I look forward to also hearing your views as the speakers share their views on trust and what it means to them, especially when it comes to scholarly communication. So I'll begin by introducing the speakers. We have four amazing speakers or panelists for this session, and we have Ivan Oransky. He is the co-founder of Retraction Watch, and he's also the editor-in-chief of Spectrum and a distinguished journalist in residence at New York University's Carter Journalism Institute, where he teaches medical journalism in the Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting program. And in the past, he's been the vice president of editorial at Medscape, vice president and global editorial director of MedPage Today, executive editor of Reuters Health, managing editor online of Scientific American, and deputy editor of The Scientist, deputy editor of The Scientist, and editor-in-chief of the now defunct Praxis Past. Ivan earned his bachelor's at Harvard, where he was the executive editor of the Harvard Crimson, and he got his MD at New York University School of Medicine in 2015. He was awarded the John F. P. McGovern Award for Excellence in Biomedical Communication from the American Medical Writers Association, and that was in 2017, and he received an honorary doctorate of civil laws from the University of the South, Sewanee. Our next speaker is Miss Judith Barnsby. She's the head of editorial of the Directory of Open Access Journals. Judith has 25 years of experience in the scholarly publishing industry, working for a range of nonprofit society publishers and service providers before joining DOAJ. She has a keen interest in publishing standards and protocols, and has served on the board of CLOCS and as chair of the PALS, that is Publisher and Library Solutions Working Group in the UK. Judith loves books, especially detective fiction, and volunteers in her local library. Welcome, Judith. Our next speaker is, or rather our next panelist is Dr. Ixchel Faniel, and she's a senior research scientist at the OCLC Research Division of OCLC Online Computer Library Center in Dublin, Ohio. And what OCLC does is that it accelerates research and scales learning and innovation and collaboration to advance libraries and librarianship. Ixchel's research interests include improving how people discover, access, and use and reuse content. She's currently examining how academics manage, share, and reuse research data, and librarians' experiences designing and delivering supportive research data management programs. And our final speaker is Dr. Haseeb Irfanullah. He's coming in from Bangladesh. And Dr. Irfanullah is a visiting research fellow for the Center for Sustainable Development, that is the CSD. And he's a part-time visiting research fellow of the CSD and he's got over 19 years experience in which he's evolved from being an algal taxonomist to an aquatic ecologist, from a conservationist to a development practitioner. At the current stage of his evolution, Dr. Irfanullah finds his niche in nature-people knowledge nexus. And over these years, he's developed interest in understanding the natural resource management of environmental governance, climate change adaptation, disaster risk management, technological innovation, poverty alleviation, and all focusing on the well-being of human beings. He has worked for and been associated with many national and international environmental development, land and research organization donors, government agencies in different capacities, and he's also associated with many peer-reviewed journals, learned societies, funding agencies, and knowledge and professional networks. He's also a scholarly chef, and he also helps his organizations with strategic direction and expert opinion, especially when it comes to influencing policies and practices, planning, managing, and ensuring quality of programs of fundraising and financial management. Welcome, panelists. And I hope you're ready to delve into this interesting discussion that we're going to go through on trust in scholarly communication. So as we begin, I'd like to ask you, Ivan, what role do retractions play in trust in science and scientific publishing, bearing in mind that you are one of the founders of Retraction Watch?
Sure. Well, thanks to DOAJ for having me, and thank you, Joy, for moderating this, what I hope will be what I know will be a very exciting and interesting session. I would say that, first of all, to define retractions, because I think it's important for everyone to, at least know what I mean when I say retraction. And it means that for one reason or another, a journal has said, and it may be because the author said, or university, or an funding agency, this paper you're looking at, this article or this item, is not reliable anymore. And that's really all it means. Now, it may be because someone committed misconduct, and maybe because they committed they made an error. It could be any number of things. But what it actually literally means is don't rely on this anymore for some reason. And I think that sort of brings me to thinking about how retractions play a role in trust. Retractions are a pretty serious matter. I find them, of course, fascinating. It's why I'm a volunteer dedicating so much time to Retraction Watch. But as a marker of trust, while I think the initial response that many people have is to say, oh, that means we can't trust what we are reading here, which is true, there's a sort of, effect that has, like a ripple effect that has, where people then make assumptions about, well, I can't trust anything from that journal. I can't trust anything from that university. I can't trust anything from that author. And those, I think, are actually probably the opposite of a reaction that I would welcome people to have in terms of trust, which is that retraction should be seen as science doing what it should, and whoever is taking that action doing what it should, and should actually instill more trust and build trust. And there are actually some studies of how this works, which I'd be happy to talk about further on, but I'll yield now and just say that as a general statement, retraction should be seen as something having gone wrong, but as a way to instill more trust when they happen.
Fantastic. And I like the way you say that it should be seen also as a marker of trust. And retraction is really part of the evolution of trust as we know it. And this leads to my next question to everyone else. How has trust evolved over time? And when it comes to publishers, especially when it comes to publishers, processes, and community, how do you see trust as a dynamic issue in this entire process? So, Haseeb, would you like to answer that first?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I fully agree with Ivan that trust retraction, which sounds a bit negative probably, but it has got, I also believe that it is actually re-emphasizing or re-establishing the trust within the system. But I also see that it is evolving. It is always evolving, because to me, trust is all about, I define trust as a kind of within a system, like a scholarly publishing system. What do we expect from each other as actors, So is my counterpart or other actors are playing the same, acting the way I'm expecting them to act. So it is a kind of matching the expectation. And definitely it evolves. I can give a very quick example, since we have already heard from Dominic that AI has just have been phenomenon, the discussion, everybody is talking about it. And we are talking about, at the moment, no, don't use AI in, say, peer review system. So it is a kind of a current way of thinking. So we are trying to instill, inbuilt what to do and what not to do, what to trust and what to not trust. And one of the reasons is it might be biased. On the other hand, if I may conclude by saying another example, you see, peer review is the kind of a core value that we carry when we talk about journal publishing. And we have been talking about double anonymous, single anonymous system. But now it has totally evolved. We are talking about open peer review system. Everybody should know who is giving comments and what is the comment is all about. So we are trusting that, no, there will not be any bias. Let us be open as much as possible. And some are actually taking the middle ground. Well, we will disclose the name of the reviewer when the paper is published. So you can see 360 years publishing ecosystem, publishing system, journal publishing system. Over the last decade or so, we just redefined what do we mean by trust in peer review system. Thank you.
Okay, Ixchel, the kind of research you're working on, I'm sure and I believe that elements of trust come in very handy. So could you take us through what your views are on the evolution of trust? Do you feel that it is dynamic? Do you feel that there are still elements of bias, as what Haseeb has brought out?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, if we just think about trust in our own lives, right? I think it's easy for all of us to see that it's a dynamic issue, right? When trust is breached, and I'm sure we've all had it breached in some way, shape, or form over the course of our lives, actions have to be taken to regain it. Ivan provided an excellent example of that in terms of retractions and kind of a journal's reputation. And I can also see the need for it to be like rebuilt or reinforced in new and changing circumstances, which I think OA still feels kind of new to people, even though it's been around for a while and was introduced maybe in the early 2000s. It continues to evolve. And if I think about it in terms of trust in a community's trust about publishers and processors, processes, I'll rely on a current project that I'm currently working on with folks at OCLC. And it's called Open Access Discovery. So we're investigating how academic libraries can improve the discoverability of scholarly peer-reviewed open access publications for their user communities. And it's research that's being conducted in the Netherlands with 7 Dutch academic libraries. So one of the ways we collected data in this project is conducting 7 group interviews with library staff at these 7 institutions, and covered 4 topics of inquiry, one of which was selecting and adding scholarly OA publications to their library collections. So it kind of gave us an insight into kind of even how librarians and library staff are experiencing, trust to the point that they actually bring in OA publications into their collections. And it's one of the places I think that trust still needs to kind of evolve or be rebuilt because of all of the OA publishers that are out there now. And I say this given findings when they talked about kind of their selection criteria that they use to decide whether and if so how they want to include open access journals and what those are. And some of the things that they talked about was just, number one, trying to figure out how to value OA publications and their quality. And some of that I think comes from just the fact that you know, there's a lot of discussion around what's predatory journals versus what aren't predatory journals. So some library staff, and I think Dom actually mentioned a couple of these things up front when we were talking about trust, they feel most comfortable adding well-established publishers to their collections a lot of the time. So that they use for licensed content. And then they also then go and say, okay, well, what are they creating in terms of OA publications and collections? And they feel more comfortable about that because it's a known. Some don't add any actually publications or journals to their collections. Sometimes it's all the volume of content that they actually feel they need to kind of go through to decide what they should be adding and what they shouldn't be adding, and how to evaluate that. And it's just a time factor. Many added upon request because of what they call quality issues. So, and those requests typically come from their information specialists, their subject librarians who have done research on it, or their user communities, faculty, researchers, teachers see a publication that's of interest to them, and they use those evaluations to kind of bring it in. So that idea of recommendations that Don talked at the top, I think, as well. And then they also rely on just the work of organizations like DOAJ, right? They know that there's a vetting process in place, right? Where they are deciding what they include versus what they don't include. Yes. And that makes them more comfortable as well. They have someone else is doing the work, and it is a trusted institution in their mind that's doing that work, right? So it's like a third-party recommendation or certification. I'll use that term loosely. Judith, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but that's kind of how I see it. But that's the other way in which they're bringing it into their collection. And so, yeah, those are some of the things that I'm seeing just in terms of that, and kind of how it's changing in terms of how libraries are seeing it versus licensed content and what they're really relying on.
And this really, honestly, thanks Ixchel for that. And this really connects with what DOAJ is doing, and it makes sense now for me to ask Judith. In regards to trust, when you look at DOAJ's perspective, do you see it as term that has evolved, especially knowing the fact that DOAJ is working with publishers, also you're working with processors, and you also at the same time you're working with the community. And with what Ixchel has mentioned, trust is about continuously rebuilding the conversation and assuring the various communities that what you're presenting or what is being shared is something they can rely on. And also looking at what Ivan has mentioned, that trust should always be seen as, retraction in what you're saying should be seen as a mark of trust. And there are cases where DOAJ has not allowed journals to be published because they don't meet the cut. So this is about reassuring the community that what is going to be presented is good quality. This is an issue of building trust. So could you take me through what trust means to you in terms of its evolution, as a process, by working with DOAJ and also working with publishers as well, and the dynamism that you're observing from it?
Thanks, Joy. It is a very dynamic process. I think even in the time since I've been at DOAJ, which is, I think, 8 years now, we have changed quite a lot in what we look at in terms of journals that apply to us.
Right.
So it is a changing aspect of our work, that we have a set of criteria that we assess journals on, and those criteria are not set in stone forever. They can change, they can evolve, and they evolve usually due to developments in what people are publishing and how people are publishing. So, for instance, we have just added some criteria on special issues, because special issues has been in the news quite a lot recently. Quite a lot of retractions, as Ivan knows, due to some flawed processes in special issues at some publishers. So we've recently just added those criteria. But if you go back further, I think just before I joined DOAJ, we had put some much stricter criteria for inclusion together, and then asked all the journals that were currently listed in DOAJ at that time to reapply, because at that point there'd been a publishing sting and there'd been some other issues that meant there was a loss of confidence in open access journals at that time. So we put in these much stricter criteria. We asked every journal that was indexed to apply, and so every journal got reassessed, and the journals that didn't apply or the journals that didn't meet the new criteria were then removed from DOAJ. So I think from my perspective, that's really the start of how we really started to look at what a journal needed to do in order to be trusted to be listed in DOAJ. And those criteria were much stricter than they had been before, and they've got stricter all the time. You know, we're always looking at more things that we need to check, more things. I think because also we get more experience of what the bad actors in publishing are doing. So our criteria, we have to have a balance between, we want to allow the good journal that perhaps doesn't have much in the way of resource or doesn't have much in the way of money to help their processes. We want to help those, but we want to keep out the journals that are doing bad things for bad reasons. So so we have changed a lot, and it's now become much more difficult easily to identify a predatory, or what we prefer to call questionable publisher, because they're much more professional than they used to be. A few years ago, you could tell because the websites were very amateurish. They had lots of flashing lights and bad spelling, and they just didn't look credible. But now they can look very, very professional, and you might have to do some quite in-depth investigation to determine that that publisher is not a reputable publisher that you want their journals indexed in DOAJ. So I think it is very dynamic, and everything has evolved really quite quickly in the last few years.
Yeah, and you know what, you're right, Judith, because also with the rise of AI, it is making it a bit much more difficult to identify a good quality journal vis-a-vis one that has gone through the entire correct process. And it makes you, and with the rise of paper mill publishers, you know, we've just seen one of the publishers, I'm not going to name names right now. We are very neutral in this conversation. So one of the publishers made an announcement that they were absorbing one of their new partners because they found out that about 60% of their journals were paper mills and they were managed by AI. So when you're looking at trust, I really understand why you have concerns as DOAJ in making sure you have very strict criteria to accept good quality journals, but journals that meet the standards that you've set, because at the end of the day, you're trying to build trust with the community and reassure the community. And that leads me to the next question, which will be on another marker that is used to measure trust, and that is integrity. And when you're looking at integrity in publishing, the aspect of AI comes in very handy. And the first question I'm going to ask is to Haseeb, and that is the fact that you've been associated with scholarly publishing, and or rather you're looking into it either also as a researcher or as an author, but you're also an editor with the Scholarly Kitchen. So basically you're a chef with the Scholarly Kitchen. So what does trust mean to you in the space of, or in the context of integrity and AI, particularly when it comes to publishing?
Thanks, Joy. Yeah, I think we have touched upon the issue of integrity from the very beginning. But if I unpack what I mean by what I see, how I see trust, I think we need to look into different dimensions. One we have touched upon is integrity, definitely. But the other one is how do we value certain parts of the publishing system? For example, DOAJ. we trust them as a kind of the way they work through the expectation they actually pose. The other aspect of other dimension of trust, I would say transparency, how transparent you are, how open you are. As we have seen, I have just mentioned about a reviewer's name. Are we sharing it or not? But even as an author, am I declaring honestly that I have used AI for certain reason or not? Because my language might not be up to the mark as journalists expecting, once again, expectation. The other aspect or dimension of trust to me is the equity aspect, because we know that the whole publishing ecosystem, it is not only geographical, but there are so many other dimensions or the dimensions of diversity. And we need to give equal opportunity at least so that everybody can join in, especially who are lagging behind. So can we trust as an author to a publisher that it is actually applying the waiver or discount rules, considering the research for live countries? So there are so many different layers. Talking about equity, for example, if I touch upon your question that how AI is actually contributing to integrity. Yes, we know that, but also how it is contributing to equity as well. If we have been using AI for the initial screening, one of the concerns with AI, because we teach it, so will it be biased towards me or it will be supporting me? But I would like to conclude in that way by saying that it is too early to predict, but
right.
I would like to trust AI that it will be evolved to facilitate judicious application of AI so that the publishing ecosystem become more and more equitable. Thank you.
So you're looking at a situation whereby we as users will use AI responsibly. But unfortunately, that is not really the reality at the moment because it's been abused. And the next question to everyone else is that the fact that we're in the era of AI and it is already being used in editorial decisions, what aspects should we look out for when it comes to trust and integrity relating to AI? And as I just mentioned, in the news today, one of the publishers have been absolved because they found out that 60% of their journals were producing paper mills supported by AI. So how do you think what do you think we should look out for when it comes to trust and integrity relating to AI? I want Judith to begin this because you had already raised a concern about the rise of paper mills and how it's becoming a bit difficult it's becoming a bit more challenging for DOAJ to identify obvious predatory journals or publishers.
Yes, and I think, I think the challenge is also for publishers to be able to identify AI-generated articles. Are there processes, are there procedures robust enough? Are they good enough yet to be able to identify the difference between what Haseeb said about, if you're using AI in a transparent way, so you're just using it to improve your English, for instance, which is, a perfectly reasonable use of AI, but are you actually using AI to write the paper? You've got to be able to identify that AI makes up references. It's you've got to be able to have some tools that can identify that it's writing nonsense or the references are not real. So I think that's the challenge, first of all, for the publishers, and also then for people like us to be able to identify what are those papers that are coming in that they need to discount straight away, then they don't waste their time on them. And then I think also when you're talking about AI within the procedures, can you trust an AI-based peer review system to do that job?
That's a good question.
Do that job better than humans? Or is you know, I think Haseeb made a point that I'd been thinking of, you know, when you've trained that AI, is it going to be biased against you or for you? So I think we've all seen examples of, you know, AI that's been badly trained and, you know, by, you know, white boys in California, that is automatically biased against people who aren't the same. So I think, you know, I think it's important. It's something I think we're in the middle of at the moment. I don't think there are robust enough tools out there yet, but publishers have got to work really hard to get them.
Oh yes, oh yes, oh yes. I mean, they really have to be on their toes, because AI is about what you feed it, but at the same time, they have to be a bit more, the publishers have to be a bit more conscientious so that they don't just find themselves with paper mills produced by AI. And yes, you brought up a very interesting issue on the peer review and AI. I'll just throw it out there. What are your views? Would you trust AI to do peer review? This is for everyone else. Ivan, would you trust AI to do peer review? Judith brought it up. So I'm curious, especially from a retraction perspective. Ivan.
Yeah, I mean, let me say a few things. I mean, one is I would like to expand that discussion and question a bit to what do we actually mean by peer review? I think that there's been a lot, the same way there's sort of this false binary about many, you know, issues in humanity, you know, in society. There's this false binary of something's peer reviewed or it's not. And I think that, you know, Haseeb mentioned earlier that there's been much more transparency, or there's a movement for more transparency in peer review and sort of actually seeing the peer reviews. I'm less concerned about seeing who did the peer review actually. And I think that there's a lot of reasons why we'd want to maintain the anonymity because of people who are vulnerable, particularly junior researchers or those who are already marginalized, for example, who may put themselves at greater risk. But so I think that we have to actually have a conversation about trusting peer review as what it is and what it is in practice. The other thing, though, I wanted to so whether or not AI, I almost think that's we aren't ready for that discussion, because we haven't sort of had, I don't mean this group, I mean in the world, has really figured out what we mean by peer review. Everybody means something a bit different. But I do also want to say that there's a sort of there was a little bit of a thread in the earlier comments about AI and peer review that it almost suggested that publishers were the victims, and yes, there could be that interpretation, and it's probably true to some extent. But I sort of gently critique that notion and say that part of the problem we have with trust is that the motivations and the incentives for authors to publish, we talk a lot about that. We don't talk as much about the incentives and the motivations for publishers to create incredibly large volumes of publications that honestly can't possibly be peer reviewed at the which gets me back to my question about what is peer review, at the level that we sort of at least intuit or you know have an implication is actually being performed. And so I think we need to look really hard at those incentives and not and you know, you mentioned special issue. A couple of people I think have mentioned special issues. I will be polite and not mention the publisher you mentioned, but I will also tell people to look at the homepage of Retractions right now to see what it is. Special issues are a way for journals and publishers to print money, and we really need to sort of think about whether that is the way we want to incentivize publication. So I think all of that, you know, it's not that thinking about AI and peer review is unimportant. I think it's very important, but I think that we are sort of, as we would say, looking for the horse that is run out of the barn, rather than noticing that the barn is on fire.
Okay, all right. Haseeb, what would you like to contribute to that?
Actually, I just posted a piece that I wrote just you know, a couple of months back. I was suggesting ending ending human-dependent peer review. I proposed 5 different stages. I was just coming from different direction without going into detail. I think the peer review system, human-dependent peer review system, is extremely inequitable. I can talk about it later on when I will be. I'd like to touch upon APC issues in terms of trust. But I think to move away, it is not possible to move away from that inequitable system where we actually kind of exploit the free service from the peer reviewer. That's why I understand there are lots of gaps. Technology is not there. We need to take a huge leap of technological advancement. But I would advocate for peer review to be automated as much as possible. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Okay. And now, so we've talked about AI, we've talked about the integrity aspect as a marker of trust, and also we've discussed about the evolution of it. But now we need to look at the various stakeholders, the community, and their influence when it comes to trust. Ixchel, can you talk about some of the work you're doing and how it goes in line with today's theme on trust in DOAJ as a digital space? Ixchel, why I'm picking you as the first speaker on this is because you're working with researchers, and these are the direct stakeholders who influence elements of trust, who need constant reassurance on trust. So if you could take us through your work and how it goes in line with today's theme of trust, and how as stakeholders they influence trust, that would be really nice to hear. Ixchel?
Tall order, but I'll start. I may have to come back
Super.
when I start thinking, when my brain warms up a little bit. But I guess in terms of looking at the needs and the practices of scholars, and again, I started looking at this in terms of reusing research data, right? A couple of colleagues and I have been examining factors that are needed to have trust in digital repositories, so such that it's positively related to then using that repository over and over and over again. And it took us into the trust literature. We've been talking a lot about trust, and the trust literature is vast, right? It covers people, it covers organizations, it covers information systems. And I said, as I said earlier, all of us have a sense of trust, right? We have this innate sense of what it means for us to trust someone or something, because it shows up in our lives so much, whether it's our relationships with people, organization, technology, or digital spaces. And this is scholars as well as just the general public. We're just like we're all sitting in this, right? In some way, shape, or form. And if we think about the early days of like online shopping, right, there were like questions and actually fears of going online and actually buying something and asking whether or not it was safe. And the question was whether or not, people were going to be vulnerable in that online exchange of goods and information and services. Were they going to give up their 10-digit credit card number and the PIN to buy something online and think that no one's going to steal that and use that later? And so we talked a lot about definitions, and it's really that idea about the willingness to be vulnerable. So when I think about trust in DOJ as a digital space, I see it as a similar question, right? This idea of vulnerability and taking risk in that online exchange of open access journals and articles, with the expectation that DOJ is going to come through without being monitored, without being controlled. They're going to come through for us, and we don't have to monitor them around that. That's part of it as well. And so when posing questions about trust, there's a set of factors that typically come up, and we've actually been talking about them all morning, right? So we've talked about integrity. That's a key one in terms of being forthcoming and honest. We talked about the transparency a little bit. So this idea of visibility and access into, the behaviors and intentions of what you're trusting. And in this case, we're thinking about DOAJ in this context. There are other ones that come up too in terms of benevolence, right? Just showing goodwill and concern for people's well-being. Ability, I think that came up a little bit as well when, Judith was talking about being able over time to develop expertise to really think about what criteria are needed so that you can suss out who which journals, are OA journals are providing good information and which might be questionable, right? So there's that idea of building up expertise and abilities over time to be able to do that, and people trusting that you have that expertise to be able to do that. And there's also just identification, right? So going back to the user communities or stakeholders that you're serving, and understanding and being able to understand and internalize, and this gets to your question a little bit, Joy, in terms of, researchers understanding and internalizing their interests and intentions such that they feel their needs and their practices are being supported in this space, whatever they need, given the research that they're doing. And so those are kind of some of the things that, we can think about going forward. So these are kind of the core concepts that I've kind of pulled out just for today. But again, the literature is large, just as we think about trust in DOJ as a digital space. And it really comes down to the perceptions of their current and potential users or stakeholder communities. And it's in a unique position because there's not just one user in my mind when it comes to DOJ, right? There are the publishers who are coming in and they're using your system because they want to, they're coming to DOJ because they want to get their journals, certified that they are meeting the criteria. They are what they say they are. They're publishing with standard quality checks. And so that's one way to think about it. But there are also the libraries, right? So there are the libraries who are either going to bring DOJ into their collections or going to provide that as an option for people who, as a recommendation, right? They're recommenders of DOJ to their user community or their researchers, and kind of thinking about it. And then you have the researchers who are coming in. And I think the interesting thing to think about, we all know what the concepts are because we talk about them over and over again, but what those actually look like in practice to each user community is, I think, when it gets interesting and sometimes hard, because they have different needs and objectives, right? In terms of what their wants are. And so I think when always thinking about trust in those ways, and when you're kind of serving more than one community, it's kind of at a very practical level. I'm always interested in understanding how are you doing it that exactly, and is it different for the different types of communities?
Okay. And that what you're saying is absolutely correct. And you pointed out a few points. You've made some key points that I note about the stakeholders. And stakeholders are vulnerable. We are vulnerable, and we are taking a risk by trusting our fellow stakeholders, but particularly in processes and in the publishing process. We are vulnerable, and the fact that we are taking risks, it means that those we trust have to be benevolent enough to offer services that, and also reassure us that the services that they're providing is something that we can rely on. We need to, and of course, various stakeholders have various needs. And the fact that, like in the case of DOAJ, trust is extremely important, and it has various communities that it is supporting, whether it is researchers, whether it is librarians, or even publishers themselves. And that leads me to the next question, and that is for everyone else. How do stakeholders, in this case, policy actors, university administrators, others outside our communities, influence the concept of trust? How do you see the stakeholders influencing the concept of trust? Bearing in mind that Ixchel has mentioned that automatically, whenever we're working with some of these, our fellow stakeholders, like in this case, DOAJ, we are already vulnerable, okay? We are taking a risk that they're going to provide us with a service. So we're relying on their benevolence to provide us with services that will be relevant to us and that would be helpful to us. And that would be of also good quality. So how do we, as stakeholders, how do these stakeholders influence the concept of trust for these processes? Haseeb.
Yeah, I was just thinking, when someone influences, whether they are my fellow stakeholder or outside the core, core system. I mean, researchers, editors, publishers, we are in the core, but we are getting influenced by external entities like policymakers, as you mentioned, administrator, political leaders, even the general mass. So we need to understand who has got the power to influence, who actually can shake our trust. That is quite important. The power is very important. But I would like to focus on, I think we sometimes miss out that we also have power within us. And I will give you very quickly one example. I was just trying to analyze that particular case. In March, you can remember all that Clarivate, they delisted 50 odd journals. I'm not talking about, of course, delisting was a kind of showing that Clarivate is quite serious about keeping the trust on. They didn't bother about the consequences. But I would like to highlight two issues. In the same blog published by Clarivate on 20th March, they mentioned that there are another 450 journals. What is happening to those? They said that in initial screening, there was something to look into. 9 months on, have they taken any, action? Then we can say that, can we really trust their initial screening? What about the slowing those investigation process actually shows that still there are 2% of journals in Clarivate or Web of Sciences database, which might not be trustworthy. So the point I'm trying to make is timeliness. Whatever you say, you have to take action to finish it. The second part I would like to talk about is justice. You see, definitely Clarivate's delisting created huge financial hit to the publishers and the journals, and their revenue earning just went down like anything, millions of dollars of loss, no doubt about it. But have we ever thought of authors, those who trusted those journals and paid APCs millions of dollars? There is no system in the world where they can actually complain or seek for compensation. We are not talking about it at all. So you see, although I'm a victim as an author, I believe that they are acting in trust. I can trust them, but when that trust was breached, nothing is happening. So I think we are vulnerable, but we don't know how vulnerable we are. So we need to think of our action, what we do and what we say, and where do we invest to increase our resilience from vulnerability. Thank you.
Interesting. Really connects with what Ixchel was talking about, how as stakeholders, we are vulnerable to the processes. And it's concerning, to be honest, when, especially from an author's perspective, when a journal is delisted and you've spent so much money, or an institute has invested so much money, and they're seeing it already as a loss. And there's nothing that can be done to mitigate that. I believe at some point there will be systems that will evolve to help compensate such authors. But at the moment, it's good to recognize, yes, we are vulnerable to this in this entire process, and we need to see how we can go above that. We can rise above that. And that leads me to Ivan. How do you think this can be done, and how do you see stakeholders influencing the concept of trust, particularly what Haseeb mentioned? Who is the most powerful influencer, especially when it comes to trust, to this, when you're looking at these stakeholders, and who's got the power in this case?
I think a lot of organizations and stakeholders have power. But I would look at funding agencies, particularly governments, also nonprofit organizations that give out a lot of funding, and universities. And I think a lot of this, again, is predicated. I'm going to take things even a step back from what Haseeb was saying. And this is about the fact that the metrics that are used to apportion funding, the international rankings, which have become, you'll forgive the term, but a bit of a fetish for universities and governments. These are all predictable, and I would argue preventable, predictable consequences. And so again, you sort of, when you take something away, we know psychology research tells us that the loss of something is much worse for the way we behave than if we never had it to begin with. And so if you take away this, you have a paper in a list in an index journal. No one stops to question the fact that that itself is based on a deeply flawed idea and a deeply flawed concept. And so I think that what would be most useful, although I think there are a lot of potential solutions here, is for universities and funding agencies and governments to break from this metric, this overriding metric of publishing in certain listed index journals. And of course there are universities that have done that, who have signed on to things like DORA, the Leiden Manifesto as well. So I think that is where I would target initiatives.
And I'd like to add to that. When you're looking at influential stakeholders, it also depends on which part of the world you're coming from. Of course, when you're in the global north, the funders are very powerful, and whatever they say influences the activities that are also happening in the global south. Then when you look at regions like South America, the governments are very powerful, and they've been very active in supporting various open science conversations. So you see, it depends on which stakeholder it depends on which part of the world you're in and who is the most active stakeholder in the entire process. In Africa, I would say the most active governments are the ones that have created granting councils. So those are about 16 countries out of 54 countries that have apportioned at least 1% of their GDP to invest in higher education and STNI. So because for now they have a voice, and before that was non-existent. It was only South Africa that was saying that was very active and vocal in terms of influencing the conversation of trust, especially in the publishing process or in the research life cycle as well. So it's also very it's a very, for lack of better words, it depends on where you are in the world and who is the most influential and who gives the biggest dollar value. And that influences processes. And when it comes to the universities that are relying on the rankings, fortunately, the ones that are not only signing up to DORA, but some that are choosing not to get involved in the rankings at some of the top research producing institutions. But then the reality on the ground is that some of the smaller institutions have to rely on this level of competitiveness in order to get funding, in order to get collaboration. So the element of trust is still reliant on the higher education business ecosystem, which is a delicate balance. That is actually the right word I was looking at. So this whole process puts everyone on a delicate balance, because on one side you want to be competitive, you want to be seen as relevant. On the other side, some of the top research institutions are saying this is not working for us, but you see, they're already getting the funding, they're already attracting the collaborations, and they're already publishing in some of the journals that would help in increasing their visibility. So all this is all about balance. And that leads me to Judith. Judith, what do you think stakeholders are doing to influence this concept of trust? So we are looking at policy actors. I know DOAJ worked very closely with the DHET, the Department of Higher Education and Training in South Africa, and it was listed as one of the journals, the platforms that researchers could get journals in. So how do you see, in this case, how have policy actors influenced the concept of trust, having worked with policy actors and also with funders and university administrators?
I think that's a really good point. There are a number of governments or funding agencies that require a researcher to publish in a listed journal. So DHET is a really good example in South Africa. There's the Medical Council in India has a list of which DOAJ journals are included at one point, and I'm not sure what the rule is now in Indonesia. That their journals had to be listed in DOAJ in order for the universities publishing those journals to get funding, and most of the journals in Indonesia come out of university departments. But so there is that side of things with policy, and of course, you know, the more organizations that require DOAJ listing is the better from our perspective, because at least there is that element that the researcher can trust where they're publishing. But I think there is also, from the institutional point of view, I think we talked about rankings in terms of journal rankings, but there's a lot of universities certainly in the global north, they're being they have a research accreditation, and they get assessed every 3 years or so. And you know, so there is a pressure on university researchers to publish, because those publications are going to be assessed as part of this exercise, and they may have to publish in journals with a certain impact factor, or they may have to publish in journals that are open access or allow some element of open access, and they may have to publish a certain number of articles. And certainly I've been aware of researchers who said, well, I've got to publish 3 articles. I've got one really good paper, so I'm going to send that to this good journal, but I've got 2 that aren't good, so I'm going to send them to these ones over here, where perhaps they're not so bothered about whether those journals are reputable or not, because it's about numbers rather than quality. So I think there's quite a lot of external factors that essentially lead to bad practices, you know. So that might be bad practices for the researcher, but you know, they're not helped by bad practices elsewhere in the publishing community and the publishing sphere. So there's a lot of influence from external parties on what you should and shouldn't trust. And you know, there was a lot of talk some years ago about whether you should trust open access at all, because you know the number of predatory publishers. But you know, I think there is evidence of fraud and paper mill papers and elsewhere, not just in open access, but in subscription journals as well. Although, as Ivan pointed out, it's a good money-making scheme if you're of that way inclined as a publisher. So yeah, it's a really complicated environment, and the influences are manifold, really.
So then what does trust mean to you from a DOAJ's perspective?
From our
Judith.
perspective, well, there's the 2 sides. There's one is, how can people trust us? And then there's us looking at journals and what we can trust from the journals. So if I talk about, you know, what we're actually doing at DOAJ in terms of our assessment and our analysis of journals, you know, we know that it's important that people can trust the index, and we get about 800 applications every single month. So we've got a large number of applications that we have to assess against the criteria that we've already talked about. And I think it's important to know that even though we do reject far more applications than we accept, you know, most of those rejections will be for kind of procedural reasons, you know. So for perhaps a journal doesn't have a licensing policy, or their copyright policy isn't clearly described, or there are some some issues with their website that they haven't been able to resolve before we've closed that application out. So most of journals that don't get into DOAJ, it doesn't mean they're not trustworthy. But there are journals that we have to look at much more thoroughly, because there are little red flags that appear when you take a look at the journal. The American Journal of so and so, but it's actually being produced in North Korea or somewhere. That's an extreme example. I don't think we have any journals from North Korea, but I think you have to look at those signals that suggest to you that maybe that publisher is not being open and upfront and honest about what they're doing. So that's as I say, most journals that are rejected are trustworthy, but we have to spend quite a lot of time looking at journals that we are concerned about. We have some reasons to feel that they may not be reputable. And I think it goes back to Haseeb's point earlier on about timeliness. I think we try and handle all those applications that we get within around 3 months. So we are trying to make sure that a publisher will get a decision on their journal in good time. And we also, again, about justice was one of your points as well, Haseeb, that if for instance somebody reports a journal to us as being, it's listed in DOAJ, but I don't think this journal is reputable, so we will investigate that journal and we will remove it if necessary. But there is always an appeals process for a journal that is rejected or removed, so that if we've made a mistake, then actually they can come back and say, no, this you've misunderstood and these are the reasons, and then we can review that decision if we need to. So I think from the community's point of view, we want to ensure that they can trust that DOAJ is trying really hard to include only trusted journals, and that we will review and remove journals that turn out to be untrusted if they are already listed. And for some of those journals, it may be that journal was perfectly acceptable when we took it into DOAJ. In fact, I'm in correspondence with somebody at the moment about a journal that has been taken over by another publisher, and they, and has changed its procedures, has changed a lot of things. That journal is now not the same journal that we accepted when we accepted it. So we then have to look at it again and say, well, actually, this journal's now changed and we need to take it out of DOAJ. So it's important that people know that they can trust us to review those journals again, that just because a journal gets into DOAJ, it won't stay there forever if it turns out not to be worth including.
All right. Thank you, Judith. And for everyone else, I'll give you a minute each. Tell me what are users' perspective when it comes to trust and their perception of DOAJ and other services. 1 minute. Haseeb?
No, I will pass. I would like to listen to others. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Ivan?
Actually the same, because we're not, we wouldn't consider ourselves able to, sort of speak on behalf of anyone, particularly about a particular service.
Oh, good. Ixchel, that comes
Leaves
down to
me.
you. To work with
Okay.
researchers. Yes.
Okay. So I'll think about it from user perspectives. I touched on it a little bit just in terms of stakeholders, but now I'm going to talk about faculty, researchers, teachers, and students when it comes to their perception of DOAJ and other services. And this is really based on a survey that we did from the participating institutions at that same project I was talking about, so the OA Discovery Project. And one of the questions we asked is kind of where they normally go to search for broadly scholarly peer-reviewed publications. So not open access, but just licensed or open access. So it was a broad question. And the open access platforms actually weren't where they normally go to search for these kinds of publications. I'll also say this was a very small sample, not representative. That was in the context of these 7 participating institutions, but the results hung together. And the top choice, and it's probably not going to be a surprise to people because this is something that's been seen in research as well as anecdotally in practice. The top choice where they normally go to search are search engines, right? They go to Google or they go to Google Scholar typically first. It doesn't necessarily mean that they trust search engines more than open access platforms like DOAJ. From experience, they're convenient, right? And they're fast. So that's why people start there typically. And they kind of bring in all this stuff that people can then kind of look at, pages and pages of things that they can wade through and look at. So it's providing relevant information quickly, right? And relevance is actually one of the top things that people want initially when they're searching. They want kind of relevant content off the top. Whether or not we trust that information that we're getting, right, in those initial searches is a different question. And so
Right.
when I think about DOJ and I think about search engines, right, again, they have different objectives for the users that they're kind of going after.
Yes.
And so when it comes to academic communities, just again thinking about this project very specifically, and we're still kind of waiting through data. So I kind of see DOJ as appealing to users who are looking to trust a source. That's what we've talked about, vetted the OA content or publications being presented in its digital space. And can say that's, has that same kind of quality control processes that they've come to expect, right? So again, picking up on Haseeb's comment, expectations from other kinds of content that have been produced in the past, typically licensed content. So I think given that, I kind of see DOJ, that's why they seem to capture library staff's attention a lot, right? Because that's what they're looking to provide their users, right? Part of their service as a library is to say, these are the sources that we've curated, these are the sources that we trust, and these are the sources that we think would be good for you to kind of look at. I think the appeal of the search engines really are for the people who are looking for like fast and convenient ways to find content. And those typical, and a lot of the user communities and academic communities, and we can think about more broadly too, I think that's one of the reasons they look at search engines. So when I'm comparing, right, these other services, right, with DOJ, that's kind of what I think about in terms of other services where they normally go to search. And I think that's also just one of the other reasons why, in terms of librarians, when they're thinking about their collections and thinking about OA and kind of what to bring in, that's one of that DOAJ is also one of the things that they bring in that I talked about at the top, as well as other ways in which they make these decisions, right, about trusted content. So that's kind of just hopefully 1 minute. I was 1 minute perspective.
Great. Thank you so much, Ixchel. And we are winding up. And before we wind up, we have some questions and answers. And please, for everyone else, please continue putting in your questions in the question and answer tab. And as you're doing that, I'll read out some of the questions that have been shared with us. Thank you so much to the panelists. It has been very engaging listening to your various views on the concept of trust and the various markers regarding trust. So now we have a question from Ross Mounts, and he asks, do we know of any publisher or single journal that promises to check the validity, existence, not AI generated, of each of these reference cited, of each and every reference that is cited? Do we know of any publisher or single journal that promises to check the validity of each and every reference that is cited? That is not AI generated.
Well,
Who would want to go for that?
I can take that. We know that there are publishers and also just services that publishers use that have made use of the Retraction Watch database, which has right now about 45,000 retractions in it, far more than any other database like that. We are now open, in which we're delighted by, and Crossref actually acquired our database, so anyone can use it for free. It's literally a click and you acquire a database. Before we were open, because we needed to license that in order to keep our staff paid. We know that certain publishers and again services like Edifix, which is owned by Wiley, and you can go to Zotero and others that license the database in order to make that service available. I don't know of any publishers that have come out and said that they are promising to do that. There may be, but I think there are now ways to do that that are actually both free and easy.
Okay. Haseeb? Or Judith?
No, I'm not.
Haseeb, yes.
Yeah, I'm not
yes.
quite aware. No, I'm not quite aware of. Apart from what Ivan mentioned, validity is a very big thing, isn't it?
It is.
Checking, linking, that's fine. With or without DOI, I'm not quite aware of. Judith may be able to touch upon. Thank you.
Okay, Judith.
I don't think I can add anything to what I've said, to be honest.
All right. Okay. All right. Then there's another question there's a question from John Dove, and he's asked, and this is for everyone. There are so many discovery tools and search engines, as well as academic discovery solutions that are based on popularity as a measure of trust. How can DOAJ distinguish itself from popularity, impact, and usage? It's a good one. Judith, that's for you. And then everyone else.
Well, I think we have always said that we don't support things like an impact factor as a measure of a journal. So DOAJ really doesn't try to say that this journal is better than that journal. We try, and ensure that all the journals that are listed in DOAJ, they meet a set of criteria, but we don't try and say that one journal is better than another journal. We do have something called the DOAJ seal for best practice, but that really has always been awarded just to show that a journal meets some best practice criteria for openness. So it's about licensing, it's about identifiers, metadata, preservation, etc. So, but that doesn't say that a journal that's got the seal is of a better editorial quality than a journal that hasn't got the seal, because we make no attempt to do that. So we're really not talking about popularity of journals at all.
It's just good journals.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, you need good quality journals. And which, again, Ross has asked this question, which you may answer, Judith, or anyone else, and that is, how is DOAJ responding to the OA Diamond journal study that was published in 2021? I'll put the link in the chat for everyone else. The study revealed that there are many great open access journals trusted by their communities that are currently not indexed in DOAJ. Does it not undermine trust in DOAJ if DOAJ does not have some of the great trusted open access journals listed in it? So this could be even for you, Ixchel, because not all journals are indexed in DOAJ and they are trusted by their communities. So does it undermine trust from the community's perspective? I'll put the link for everyone else. You can start, Ixchel, and then
yeah. I haven't read the study. I just actually clicked on the link so I could save it for later. But I think this is a good example of, because I do think trust is built within the community, right? So, right, they have expectations that they have created among themselves as a disciplinary community. And they try to teach those things, you know, from PhD students forward, right, to the. So I think this is a good example of the community trusts it and understanding why the community trusts it and being able to use it for those reasons. It's just another kind of way in which trust develops and forms, as long as they are still doing all of the other things that we've talked about, right? Integrity, transparency. Haseeb talked about justice, and, you know, in trust, it's structural assurance. It's the same thing. Is there recourse when something goes sideways or wrong, right? And how do they kind of recover from that, and such that people trust it? So I think I think this is also just another thing that librarians are thinking about too, because there's so much in terms of OA out there. One of the things that came up in that study is, how do we begin to value these things? How do we begin to know what's good versus bad, what's good information or not good information? And they do rely on the researchers that are and their user community that's making recommendations for things that they want to bring into their collections. So a great question, because I think there is a lot that's out there. And as Judith said, if it's not out there, it doesn't mean that you can't trust it, right? Maybe it hasn't gone through the process yet, or maybe it has gone through the process and there's something procedural that needs to be corrected. So I think that's the big question as well for a lot of librarians, just because there's so much out there and it all hasn't kind of gone through processes that it needs to go through. But trusting things from the community, I think, is a key thing. And that starts, you know, as a PhD, when you enter school and your advisors, what are they telling you you need to publish in? I mean, when I was prepping for this, that's what it reminded me of. I remember the whole ABC journal thing, and I was like, gosh, I'm glad I'm not doing that anymore. So because it's also pressure filled, and it's not, and it's you know, you're trying to fit this gigantic group of people through this very small pipeline of opportunity that's available to them. So, you know, these other options are interesting and good options.
If I could just follow up on for
yes, Judith. Yes, continue.
I think
Judith. Yes.
Ixchel made a really valid point in there, that a journal may not have gone through the process of being indexed at DOAJ. And that's one of the things that a lot of people don't realize, is that a journal has to apply to be in DOAJ. We don't go out and add journals, you know, a journal has to apply. And I think a lot of smaller, perhaps diamond journals, have not necessarily been motivated to apply to DOAJ, because, for instance, with the introduction of Plan S, journals that charge an APC were motivated to apply to DOAJ because they needed to be listed in DOAJ for the Plan S funders to pay those APCs. So we had a lot more applications from commercial publishers when Plan S was introduced. And so there hasn't necessarily been that incentive, that driver for the smaller journals to be listed in DOAJ. We're incredibly supportive of Diamond Open Access, and we would like as many Diamond journals to be listed in DOAJ as possible. So we would encourage them to apply for sure.
Right. Ivan, would you like to say something, or Haseeb?
I don't know that I'm all that qualified to say anything about sort of listing at DOAJ, so I'd like to hear from others if they have other comments.
Okay, Haseeb?
Very quickly, I was just thinking, when we talk about open access journal, as Judith mentioned, that of course APC is a big issue, and if we bring in that trust here, I was just wondering that that's quite fantastic, quite phenomenal, that we can trust someone even if there is no transparency in it. Let me give you a very quick example. If you visit Elsevier's website, the pricing page of APC, you will see that they declare from $150 up to $9,900 APC could be charged by the different journals. So it is the lowest APC and the highest APC, it is 66 times, but there is no calculation given how the APC is being calculated. So same publisher, thousands of journals from $150 to $9,900. So we are trusting that those journals are very good. They are not declaring publicly, they are not accountable, they are not transparent enough, but still they're publishing. So it's a very interesting fact that you can trust someone without being, who are not transparent enough. So we need to think those aspects of trust as well. It is so complicated to me. Trust is so fluid, so complicated, so multidimensional. But we need to, but I'm really glad that I have been joining this conversation. Thank you.
Good. And it leads to the last question. And this is from Stephen, let me pronounce the name properly, Vidovich. And his comment is about the delisting of Clarivate's databases. And he said the delisting of the Clarivate database was used as a marker of trust, but lots of good and reputable journals were never even listed there in the first place. Additionally, many people who need to check for trusted publishing platforms don't have access to the commercial platforms like Web of Science. Unlike the DOAJ, which is community-based, it does strive for community set standards, and there needs to be more community set standards for using inclusive databases which are openly available. So basically what he's saying is that there's a need to push for community-based databases like DOAJ. And he does make a point, because let's be honest, in Africa, there are about maybe 2 countries that can afford, and I say countries at national level, that can afford Web of Science. So even with the delisting itself, the impact would not have been felt in Africa. And as much as they have the Emerging Sources Citation Index, which is meant to bring in journals from the periphery, it would still not make an impact on our side. So that's a very good comment, Stephen. So we need to work with to actively work with community-based journals that are much more accessible to communities in the periphery, not only in the periphery, but also even in the global north. There are countries in the global north, there are institutions within the global north that still cannot afford some of these commercial-based solutions. So working with community-based research discovery solutions like DOAJ are essential to not only building trust, but also building fighting for social justice, in making sure that every community has equitable access to these resources. Thank you so much, everyone. This has been a very exciting discussion. Trust is a very touchy topic, to a certain degree, a bit emotional, because it's tied to our careers, promotions, funding, collaborations, and most importantly, reputation as an institute or even individual researchers. Thank you so much for having made it for this webinar, wherever you are in the world. And I'd like to hand over to Dominic. Dominic, over to you.
Thank you, Joy. And thank you to all of our speakers for such a stimulating discussion. It's been really great listening in, and I think that we've heard a lot about what trust means for scholarship today, and the questions from our audience. Thank you to all of those who submitted those. It's been complemented the discussion nicely. Thank you, Joy, for doing a great job as moderator. And to all of you who have attended today, don't forget to fill in our feedback form. Thank you. And just before we go, I have to say thank you to our event sponsors who helped to make this event possible. Thank you to all of you. Have a great rest of your day wherever you are, and we will see you soon. Bye-bye.